November 24th, 1944, 30,000 feet above Tokyo, Japan. The air was thin and bitterly cold, a crystalline void where breath frosted instantly on the inside of cockpit glass. Inside the pressurized cabin of Dauntless Dottie, a B-29 Superfortress, Captain Jack Edwards gripped the control yoke, his knuckles white despite the thick fleece of his gloves. Below, a vast undulating carpet of white cloud obscured the earth, but every man aboard knew what lay beneath: the heart of the Japanese Empire, a city of 7 million souls and the primary target of their first-ever high-altitude raid. The four Wright R-3350 engines throbbed with a steady, powerful hum, a sound that had become the soundtrack to their long, arduous journey from the Mariana Islands. Beside Edwards, Lieutenant Sam Riggs, the bombardier, peered through the Norden bomb sight, his face pressed against the rubber eyepiece, searching for a glimpse of the Imperial Palace or the industrial districts through the occasional break in the clouds. The B-29 was a marvel of American engineering, a silver giant with a wingspan longer than a baseball diamond, capable of flying higher and faster than any Japanese fighter could reach. Its pressurized cabins allowed the crew to work without oxygen masks, a luxury unheard of in earlier bombers. Yet, inside Dauntless Dottie, tension hung as thick as the anti-aircraft smoke now beginning to blossom around them. Flak bursts peppered the sky, black puffs of death that rattled the aircraft like pebbles in a tin can. "Steady, steady," Edwards muttered, more to himself than to his crew, as he fought the turbulent winds of the jet stream, an invisible river of air howling at 200 miles per hour that shoved the 65-ton bomber off course. In the nose, Riggs cursed under his breath. "I can't get a visual. The clouds are too thick, and this wind is playing havoc with the drift." His fingers adjusted knobs on the bomb sight, but it was like trying to thread a needle in a hurricane. The B-29 had been designed for precision bombing from high altitude, but over Japan, the weather was a relentless foe. As they approached the initial point, the bomb bay doors groaned open, revealing the payload of 500-pound general-purpose bombs. "Bombs away," Riggs called out, but the tone in his voice lacked conviction. The aircraft lurched upward as the weight fell away, and Edwards banked sharply to the right, joining the stream of other B-29s turning for home. On the ground, in a fortified command bunker near Tokyo Bay, General Tadashi Miyazaki watched the contrails of the American bombers through a narrow slit in the concrete. He chuckled, turning to his aide, Colonel Sato. "Look at them, Sato-san," he said, a smirk playing on his lips. "They fly so high like arrogant eagles, but their claws cannot find their mark. Their bombs fall randomly in fields and rivers. What is the point of such a magnificent machine if it cannot hit anything? Let them waste their fuel and effort. Our skies are our shield." Sato nodded, noting the scattered explosions far from any significant target. The B-29s, once feared as a technological terror, were becoming a joke, a costly, noisy nuisance that posed little real threat. The long flight back to the Mariana Islands was a silent, grim affair. Inside Dauntless Dottie, the initial relief of having survived the flak was replaced by a gnawing sense of futility. Captain Edwards stared blankly at the instrument panel, the steady drone of the engines a monotonous echo of his thoughts. They had flown over 2,500 miles, risked their lives for hours in freezing skies, and for what? Post-strike reconnaissance would later confirm their fears. The bombs had scattered harmlessly across the Tokyo suburbs and into the waters of Tokyo Bay. The much-vaunted Nakajima Aircraft Factory, their primary target, remained untouched. This scene repeated itself across the 21st Bomber Command in the winter of 1944-45. The B-29s were bleeding themselves white for negligible results. The jet stream, a phenomenon barely understood at the time, wreaked havoc on bombing accuracy, scattering bombs miles off target. Mechanical failures were rampant. The complex, cutting-edge R-3350 engines were prone to overheating and catching fire, turning more Superfortresses into funeral pyres than Japanese anti-aircraft guns did. Crew morale plummeted. They were flying the most advanced bomber in the world on what felt like a suicide mission with no strategic payoff. In the officers' club on Tinian, the air was thick with frustration and the smell of stale coffee. "We're not hurting them," Edwards said to a fellow pilot, swirling the brown liquid in his mug. "We're just giving their gunners target practice." In his headquarters, a makeshift building surrounded by palm trees and hardstands filled with the Silver Giants, the new commander of the 21st Bomber Command, General Curtis LeMay, pored over the damning mission reports. A bear of a man with a permanent scowl and a cigar clamped between his teeth, LeMay was a pragmatist of the highest order. The data was undeniable. High-altitude precision bombing was a catastrophic failure over Japan. The weather would not change, and he couldn't tame the jet stream. He needed a new solution, one that was so radical, so contrary to all established American bombing doctrine that it would either get him court-martialed or end the war. He stared at reconnaissance photos of Tokyo's densely packed wood and paper construction. He studied the weak points in Japanese air defenses, the lack of powerful searchlights, the ineffective night fighters, the sparse low-altitude flak. A brutal, terrifying plan began to form in his mind. He would strip the B-29s of their defensive armament, send them in at night, and fly them low. So low his crews would be able to smell the city burning, and he would not use high explosives. He would use fire. The orders, when they came, were met with disbelief, then with a cold, simmering fury that bordered on mutiny. There was no gentle briefing, no gradual persuasion. General Curtis LeMay had issued a direct, brutal command that rewrote the entire book of strategic bombing. Captain Edwards held the mimeographed sheet in his hand, reading the words over and over as if they were in a foreign language. Mission 40. Night. Low-level incendiary attack on Tokyo. The specifics were staggering. They were to remove all but the tail guns to save weight. They were to fly individually, not in formation, to avoid mid-air collisions. They were to come in at 5,000 to 9,000 feet, an altitude where every civilian with a rifle could hit them, and they were to do it at night. In the sweltering heat of the briefing hut, the murmur of the crews grew into a roar of protest. A major stood up, his face flushed. "Sir, with all due respect, this is suicide. We'll be sitting ducks for the flak batteries." The briefing officer, a stone-faced colonel, didn't flinch. "The flak batteries are calibrated for high-altitude attacks. Their night fighters are ineffective. Their searchlights are weak. General LeMay has calculated the risks." "Calculated?" Another pilot spat. "He's calculating how to get us all killed." Edwards sat in silence, the pragmatism of the plan cutting through his fear. They had been achieving nothing. This, at least, was a clear, if terrifying, course of action. On the evening of March 9, 1945, the atmosphere on Tinian was funereal. The ground crews had worked frantically, stripping the B-29s of their ventral and forward gun turrets, the piles of 50-caliber machine guns growing beside the hardstands. The bomb bays were now loaded with clusters of M69 incendiaries, cylindrical napalm-filled bombs that scattered on release, spewing a sticky, burning gel. As Edwards performed his pre-flight check on dauntless Dottie, the aircraft felt alien, lighter, and more vulnerable without its teeth. He looked at his crew, their faces grim in the twilight. "We all know the order," he said, his voice low but carrying. "We all know the risk, but we also know what we've been doing until now hasn't been working. Tonight, we make it work." There were no cheers, only determined nods. One by one, the engines coughed to life, and the Silver Giants began their slow, heavy roll down the runway, lifting into the darkening Pacific sky, turning not towards the safe, high altitudes, but towards the fiery hell that awaited them low over Tokyo. March 10, 1945, 2:30 a.m., 5,000 feet over Tokyo Bay. The world had turned upside down. Captain Edwards gripped the yoke, his knuckles bone-white, his entire body tense. This was not the serene, high-altitude realm of the Silver Giants. This was a descent into a hunter's alley. Dauntless Dottie shuddered in the turbulent thermal winds rising from the city below, winds generated not by nature, but by a man-made hell. The first Pathfinders had already done their work, marking the target area with a flaming X that glowed with malevolent intensity. As they crossed the coastline, the inky blackness below began to sparkle with hundreds of tiny, isolated fires, like matches struck in a dark room. Then the incendiaries from the lead waves began to ignite. What had been pinpricks of light coalesced into raging sheets of flame. Edwards felt a wave of heat wash over the cockpit, a sensation so alien and terrifying at 5,000 feet that his mind recoiled. "My God," the co-pilot whispered, his voice cracking. Below them, the M69 napalm incendiaries were achieving their designed purpose. The sticky, gelatinous fire clung to the wooden roofs and paper and wood walls of the Shitamachi district, spreading with terrifying speed. Individual fires began to merge, sucking oxygen from the surrounding atmosphere with the force of a forge bellows. Within minutes, the isolated conflagrations fused into a single roaring firestorm. A colossal thermal column erupted, rising thousands of feet into the air, creating a wind that shrieked through the streets at hurricane force, tearing roofs from houses and hurling embers and burning debris ahead of the flame front. The air itself became a weapon, superheating to over 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit, melting metal, and spontaneously combusting anything in its path. The rivers that crisscrossed the city began to boil. From his cockpit, Edwards saw a sight that would haunt him forever. The silhouettes of B-29s ahead of him were being tossed like leaves in the infernal updraft, their silver bellies glowing orange from the flames below. The city was no longer a target. It was a single, living entity of fire, and they were flying through its breath. The mockery of the Japanese commanders was now being answered not with precision, but with annihilation. The stench infiltrated the cockpit, of dauntless Dottie, a grotesque mixture of burning pine, scorched metal, and something unbearably organic. Captain Edwards fought the controls, his arms aching as the superheated air from the firestorm below bucked and tossed the massive bomber. The once black sky was now a dome of orange, reflecting off the clouds of smoke, creating a perpetual, hellish daylight. Through a momentary break in the smoke, he looked down. The recognizable geometry of a city was gone. Where streets and neighborhoods had been, there was now a single seething lake of fire, its surface swirling with embers. "Nothing could survive that," the navigator said over the intercom, his voice hollow with a mix of horror and awe. As they turned away from the target, the light from the inferno illuminated their faces for 100 miles, a silent, terrifying procession of arsonists fleeing the scene of their crime. On the ground, in his bunker, General Tadashi Miyazaki was no longer smirking. The concrete walls vibrated with the concussions of the continuing bomb runs. "The Americans. They have changed their tactics, General," Colonel Sato stammered, his face pale as ash. "They are not targeting factories. They are targeting everything." Miyazaki did not respond. He stared out at the orange glow that was consuming his capital, his empire, his certainty. The high-flying eagles he had mocked had become dragons, breathing fire from the lowest reaches of the sky. The very architecture of Japan, the wood and paper that formed the homes of millions of his people, had been turned into a weapon against them. His air defenses, designed to challenge high-altitude precision, were useless against this low-level, saturation horror. The technological wonder of the B-29 was no longer a curiosity. It was the delivery system for a new kind of warfare, one of total annihilation. In that moment, standing in the shaking bunker, watching his world burn, General Miyazaki understood the grim truth he would never voice aloud. This was not a battle. It was a systematic burning, and it was only the beginning. Dawn broke over Tokyo on March 10th, not with light, but with a slow, grim revelation through the choking pall of smoke that blotted out the sun. Where the bustling, densely populated Shitamachi district had once stood, there now existed a vast, flat, smoldering plain of charcoal and ash, broken only by the grotesque, twisted skeletons of reinforced concrete structures. The air was filled with the sound of silence, broken by the occasional crackle of a dying ember and the desperate, muffled cries of those digging through the ruins for survivors. The rivers were clogged with bodies of those who had sought refuge in the water, only to be boiled alive. The firestorm had consumed 16 square miles of the city, killing an estimated 100,000 people in a single night, a number that would eclipse the immediate death toll of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima. The B-29s had not simply bombed a target, they had erased a part of the map. The success of the mission, from a cold military standpoint, was staggering. Reconnaissance photos showed a scar on the Earth so complete it defied belief. In the Mariana Islands, the mood was a complex mixture of triumph and profound trauma. The crews of the 21st Bomber Command were heroes, but they were haunted heroes. They slept fitfully, the image of the firestorm burned onto the backs of their eyelids. Captain Edwards and the crew of Dauntless Dottie received a distinguished unit citation, but they never spoke of the mission in the officers' club. The debate had already begun, in whispers and in official memos. Had this been a brutal necessity to break the enemy's will and avoid a costly invasion, or had it been a descent into a new, terrifying form of warfare that erased the line between soldier and civilian? For General Curtis LeMay, there was no debate. The results were the only argument that mattered. The failure of high-altitude precision had been replaced by the horrific efficiency of low-altitude annihilation. The raid on March 10th was not the end. It was the blueprint. In the weeks that followed, the same terrible fate was visited upon Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, and dozens of other Japanese cities. The B-29s, once mocked, became the horsemen of a rain of fire, systematically burning the Japanese war-making capacity and its urban heart to the ground. The shock and disbelief now belonged entirely to the Japanese High Command. The technological curiosity had become an instrument of doom, proving that a weapon's true nature is not defined by its design, but by the ruthless logic of the hand that wields it.